Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another class in our series on ancient Israel and on Bible in the ancient Near East. Just reminding you, please mute your microphones. If you have a question, of course, you can unmute them then. So everyone, please mute yourselves. And now, so what I wanted to do today is I wanted to look at the Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions in the context of a verse that we take for granted a lot, which is Shema Israel. Right? I'll share my screen and we can go to the verse. Just a moment. Okay, go here. Here we are. Okay, so this is what we are familiar with. We are in Dvarim, right? Deuteronomy, and we're given commandments, and then we have V'shamata Yisrael, right? Hero Israel, V'shamata la'asot asher yitav lecha v'asher tirbun ma'od, right? You should do what's good for you, right? Kasher diber Adonai Elohei avotecha lach eretz zavat chalav udvash, right? Because that just as God spoke to you, you are going to have this land flowing with milk and honey. And then we start with Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, right? Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei is our God. Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei is one. All right. So what we take for granted, because I don't know about you guys, I grew up in the States. The base religion is Christianity, and of course, when you live in a place where there's Christianity, and I grew up in Boston, which is a pretty Catholic city, and there's this whole idea of the Trinity, and it's pretty clear that okay, our God is one. He doesn't have parts. He's not three different things. He's one God. Okay, he's one God, and that's not the plain meaning. That is the plain meaning. But let's take the plain meaning. What was the plain meaning for someone who heard, who was listening, who was reading this or listening to it in the context of the ancient Near East? Okay, there is no Christianity. No one's saying the Lord God actually has these three manifestations that are the Son and the Father and the Holy Ghost. No one's saying that. No one's talking about split. No one's saying that. Right? Not yet. What are they saying? What is the belief that this is supposed to combat? I will remind you, okay, and this is pretty important. This has come up recently in the news, because in the news they're like, oh my goodness, ancient Israelites ate seafood. Who could have imagined? Who would have thought it? Right? And it's like, well, anyone who reads the biblical text will know that they didn't do what they were supposed to be doing, right? And also, anyone who reads ancient texts knows that if you have a commandment telling people don't do something, it means someone is doing it, okay? Right? No one's telling people, don't eat this poisonous wood, because no one's eating the poisonous wood. Saying don't eat seafood. Someone's eating seafood. Someone's had this idea, right? Right? Someone wanted to eat an owl, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't need a commandment. Okay, so if you have a commandment, someone's thinking the other way. All right. Now, I think that's very important when we see these problems, particularly things that they're texts that some people just consider incredibly problematic. And some texts are problematic, right? Some things we find are actually present issues. But things where people are not doing what we think they're supposed to be doing, to me, doesn't present a particular issue in terms of the historical truth found in different biblical texts, because that is in fact what we would understand from reading the biblical text, that people were not in fact doing what they were supposed to be doing in all sorts of ways. So in terms of Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord is one. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one. What's this kind of working against? Now, I think a lot of us are familiar with this inscription from Dan, and you see that this is a pretty late, from our point of view, it's a pretty late inscription, the 2nd, 3rd century BCE. So you're talking about Second Temple period. This actually caused a little bit more of a problem because it's pretty late, right? And it's in Greek, right? And it's an inscription saying that it's saying that this guy named Zoilos is making an oath to the God who is in Dan. It's interesting because that's the way it is in Greek, but in the Aramaic here, it just says Bidan Nadar, and this I think is his name, right? Bidan Nadar Zilas Le'elaha. You see that? And that's the Aramaic, right? So in the Aramaic, it just says in Dan, right? And this was found in Dan. In Dan, Zilas swore to God, using a general name for God, Le'elaha, right? Here. And in the Greek, he swore to the God who is in Dan. Okay. So who is the God who is in Dan? And the idea is, well, if you've got a house of worship in Dan, a bama in Dan, then the idea is that the God lives in Dan. So he's made an oath to the God who dwells in Dan, right? So which God was this an oath to the God of Israel? Or is he using a general word for God? This is a question. We know from Melachim, from Kings, that in fact Dan was a place of worship way back. We also found what seemed to be the bama, or a bama, a place of worship, right? In general, when we have traditions that are stated in our biblical books talking about houses of worship in certain places, there's usually a long tradition of these places being like holy places. So for example, with Dan, you have a story also in Shoftim about there being something in Dan, and then you have Yeravam ben Nevat, Jeroboam, right? But Yeravam ben Nevat setting up one of his egel, one of his golden calf things, in Dan and in Bethel. Now we know that Bethel has a long tradition, right? We have this whole story of Yaakov setting up a house of worship in Bethel, right? So these are places where there's this tradition of this is a holy place, right, where you go worship. Now we can see this is pretty late. There are some questions about who is this person? What did he think he was doing? Did he really think that God dwelled in Dan? Did he mean I'm making a donation to the temple in Dan? What was there a reason that the Greek and the Aramaic are slightly different? These are questions, but let's go back to something much older and much more kind of relevant for us if we're looking at the biblical text. And that's the findings in Kuntillet Ajrud. Kuntillet Ajrud is in the North Sinai. This used to have a little marker, but it's in the Sinai. It's in Sinai. It's in North Sinai, and these are the texts that I sent to you. Let me these texts I'm going to show you. Oh, okay. If you scroll down to the very end of your handouts, I wasn't able to reorder it, but the end of your handouts show the book that this was taken from, which is Haktav HaMichtav. This is by Shmuel Achituv. Yes, there is an English translation. I do not own it. Okay, so I have the Hebrew. And it's a collection of Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions. So it doesn't have a Greek inscription, right? It doesn't have a Taldan inscription. It's because that's in Greek, so you're not going to find it there. You'll find the other Taldan inscription, which is not relevant to what we're discussing now. So we're going to be talking about Kuntillet Ajrud. Okay. Now I sent you in your handout, for those of you who feel comfortable reading Hebrew, you actually have everything that he has on it. I highly recommend this book. I like it a lot. He gives a nice. Not only does he have the inscriptions and pictures of the inscriptions and transcriptions of the inscriptions, he also gives a nice introduction to where they're found, and the dating, and sometimes the significance. Okay, so here you have 873 to 852 BCE is the date. All right. So that's the time of Ahav, as he notes. Ahab, Ahab, you can't call him Ahab, it's Ahav. Okay. And there were different things found, things on handles, different pieces, things on pieces of ceramic. So we're going to look at that. All right. So here it's a little bit hard for you to see, but here he has kind of the inscription, and you can see that it's not that easy to read, but you can pick out the letters here. So you can kind of follow along as I read the regular Hebrew, and you can kind of find it. All right. So he says, Omer, the word of something, and more, liyaheli uliyoasa, say to Yaheli and Yoasa, berachti etchem lashem shomron velashe. I have blessed you to God, to Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei, to the Lord, right, of Shomron, and to his Asherah. Okay, so here we have a lot to unpack. I'm going to read a few more of these, all right, because this is not, so here is talking to the God of Shomron and to his Asherah. What is his Asherah? We'll talk about it in just a second, okay? And here we have another piece. Okay, let me go here, where it says, and this is on the, here's the actual transcription of what we're going to read. This is a picture of it. You can see the people praying. Do you see the people praying there? Okay, so they're praying, and the picture didn't come out so good, but they're praying, and then there's a script. So it says we have Lashem HaTeman, to the God of this, that's in the south, right? Vila Asherato, and to his Asherah. Kol Asher Yish'al Me'ish Chonenhu, V'im Pata V'natan Lo Hashem or Yeho Kilvavo. Anyone who will ask of a person, he will grant him. He will be not exactly merciful, but he will kind of grant it to him. And if he requests it, and he will give it to him. God will give it to him. Yeho there means for God will give it to him as according to his wish. Kilvavo. Okay, so that you can understand. You can understand that why you have people praying here, right? Because that's the idea. The idea is not just that you're praying to the God, to the Lord, Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei, right? Who is in the south, and to his Asherah, right? And anyone who asks this, their wish will be granted, essentially. Okay. Here we have another piece where it's, I blessed you. Here, as they say, here's a letter. She says, Emor ladoni, say to my master, Hashalom ata, are you well? Berachticha li, and it starts with Lamed Yud, and then it continues in the next line, the Hey Vav Hey, right? To the Lord, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, right? I bless you to the Lord of the South, Teman, right? Now, I assume that Teman is not just for the South. I assume that it's actually referring to a specific location. Okay. And to his Asherah. Yivarech recha v'ishmerecha v'hi am im adoni, right? You should bless you and keep you, and he should be with my master. So he's using standard kind of blessing languages of God, of Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei, right? And here's another one where it's also talking about Lashem Teman V'Lashe-Rato, right? And that's and by the way, this seems to be the name. In other words, then he repeats again, Heitiv Hashem Teman, may Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei of the south of Teman do well with you, right? So that's like his name, right? The same way you have Baal Peor, right? Is the Baal and Peor, but his name is Baal Peor. Okay, and here, we continue on. Here's this is actually from this piece is from another place. This is not from Kuntillet Ajrud, but we also have this. Oh, this is for to talk about the Asherah. So before we talk about the Asherah, let's talk a little bit about what is this. We had Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei in Shomron, Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei in Teman, right? I see that there's already a question. So Moshe Matitya says there are verses in the Tanakh that speak of God as dwelling in a specific place. I think yes, That is absolutely true. And the question is, at what point does the fact that God dwells in this place mean that it's a different manifestation of God? And I think, and that's one of the things I want to kind of talk about with you for just a second. Hold on, please. Because in fact, what do we see here? What we see is that these are places with temples. These are places with temples. And the understanding of this, what that means is, I am going to bless you by the God who is there, right? In other words, he's not just living there. He's there. You have the God that's in Shomron, the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei that's in Shomron. It's not the God, right? It's Yud-Kei Vav-Kei that's in Shomron and Yud-Kei Vav-Kei that's in Teman, right? It's the Israelite God, but there's kind of one of him in Teman and there's one of him in Shomron, right? Who am I blessing you to? The one in Teman, right? So it's the idea that God dwells in a place, we know, is a very common idea. Not only does the Tanakh talk about it, but it becomes a very central belief of the Jews in Jerusalem. I've said this before, but still, that God lives here, and so this place cannot be destroyed because God lives here, right? And that was a natural thing to kind of think in terms of what is a temple if God doesn't live there, right? And even if you say, and that's why Yechezkel has a very pictorial description of God's presence leaving the temple before it's destroyed. God's presence leaves the temple before it's destroyed. It goes away, right? Because there is this very, very strong idea that that's where God lives. But then there's the next leap, which is not that big a leap to say, well, if God lives there and I went to worship in this other place, which God is there? It's also Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, right? It's also, it's also the Israelite God, but he's the one that's in Dan, or he's the one that's in Shomron. He's the one that's in Teman. And that then where is God's unity? God isn't one. How is God one? How's Yud-Kei Vav-Kei? I keep on saying God, but I feel like I want to say the name of God because that's who it is we're talking about. We're not talking about God. We're not talking about a general concept of God. We're talking about the Israelite God, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Is he one, or are there bunches of him and there are different places and in different temples, right? And that's a very basic concept that there is in the ancient Near East. Again, Baal, or there are all these different Baals. Why? Because Baal, there's something for him in Peor, there's something for him somewhere else. So you have Baal Peor, you have Baal Zvuv, you have all the different Baals, right? And they're in different locations. So the idea of Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right? There's one God. There's only one God, right? And we read about this in Devarim, where we know, of course, Devarim really, really promotes the idea that you can only worship God in one place, right? There's only one place to worship God, right? And because there's only one place to worship God, it changes rules. Like if we talk about, I was just talking about this to someone on Shabbat, we have, if you talk about Vayikra, right, in I forgot the English word for Vayikra.
Leviticus.
Thank you, Leviticus. I long day, okay. So in Vayikra, in Leviticus, we have this rule, right, that you're not allowed to eat a domesticated animal. In other words, you can eat a deer without sacrificing it because deer don't get sacrificed. But if you're eating any domestic animal, if I want to eat beef, so I am slaughtering a cow to eat the beef, I have to bring a shlamim as a sacrifice. And the shlamim is the stuff I can't eat anyway, right? It's the pieces of fat and the blood. I'm not allowed to eat those things anyway, but I have to sacrifice it to God. I can't just eat meat, right? And then when we get to Devarim, when we get to Deuteronomy, it says, sure you can. Why? Because you're going to come to the land and you're going to be far from the place, the one place where you can worship. And you still want to eat meat, right? There were no vegans in ancient Israel. And so you're still going to want to eat meat. So what are you going to do if if you live in Dan and there's only one temple and it's in Jerusalem, well, obviously you have to be able to eat meat, and you have to be able to eat it without sacrificing. So no longer do you have this rule that you have to sacrifice, right? Because in order to sacrifice to eat meat, you have to have a temple right there. Okay, so we see there's the idea of one temple and one God. We see how they go together when we read these inscriptions. When we read the inscriptions, we kind of see, because it's hard to understand. Honestly, it's hard to understand why is it so important for a single. It's God, right? He isn't seen. He's one God. Why can't I have multiple temples to him? Why, if I'm living in the north, I want to have a temple near me? I mean, it's a completely reasonable thing. I want to worship the God. There is no prayer. There's no synagogues, right? There's no way to just get together and pray. The way you worship God is you bring sacrifices. That's the way to worship God. And I don't have it where I am because I'm way up north or way down south. So it's so reasonable to want a temple. Why should I not? Why would you have this idea, what they call, the kind of this unification? Why is that important? And the answer is it's important because it was a very common idea. Oh, you're in Shomron. Well, this is the God who lives in Shomron because he lives in the temple, right? Well, that means he's not one anymore. That means you've got a version of him that is in Shomron and a version of him that's in Jerusalem, and there's a version of him that's in Beersheba, and you have these different versions. How exactly they conceived of it, right, isn't clear. But you have this also in Greek with Greek worship also. You have different Athenas and different Aphrodites and different, like, in different places. And they don't have a problem with, of course, they already have a very polytheistic religion. But this idea is, if you have one God, right, and your whole belief system is built on having one God with control, who created heaven and earth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then it's a very easy, slippery slope. Once you have and again, as Moshe pointed out, and in general, we see it all over the place, there's still this idea that God lives in the temple. Right? Even if you have things against it, of course, no temple can contain me, and but really, why are you worshiping him in the temple? Isn't that where God is? Right? So if you have multiple temples, then how does it work? Right? So that's we can see, when we see that there was this active belief, in fact, that you had Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei in the south and Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei in the north and Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei in different places. You understand why it's so important to have one temple, because God is one, right? Okay, so Moshe says, if the meaning of the Shema verse were to proclaim the singleness of God in terms of location or otherwise, then one would expect the surrounding context to relate in some way to singleness, but it doesn't. Okay, so let me address that. And of course, this is my interpretation, and feel free to disagree. In this, I don't claim some kind of whatever, but from my point of view, if you look at the way this chapter of Dvarim is structured, it's like Anochi Hashem Elokecha. It's like, I am the Lord your God, right? This is something basic. This is what we're starting with. Okay, you're gonna listen. You're gonna hear these things that you have to do, right? And now we're starting with the basics. The very basic is, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, right? You don't have this whole discussion here. What would we expect? In Moshe, in your kind of approach, what I would expect right here in this area, in this section, is right away talking about idol worship. But that's not, that comes later, right? That comes later.
I would expect it to talk about idol worship if it's talking about the that there aren't other gods, or more in line with what you were saying, if it were talking about don't worship multiple versions of me in different temples in different places, then I would expect something of which you do see things like that in Dvarim, but you don't see it here.
Look, I hear what you're saying. I think that it's a statement about the nature of God that you're supposed to understand. Like, I don't see this particular statement as a polemical one necessarily, but I think that the way you're supposed to understand it is in the context that I said. In other words, do I think that like you're right that in its context, it's not a polemical statement. It's not arguing with anything. It's just saying, right? I do think that the meaning of God is one, in terms of what else would God be? What else would God be? Of course, God is one. He's one God. He's got a single name. He's one God. What else would he be but one? And the answer is he could be the God in the north and the God in the south and the God in Shomron and the God in Jerusalem. That's what he could be. But he's not. That's what I mean. And we could, and obviously, like I said, this is how I'm interpreting it. Not just me. Like I wasn't. It's not my brilliant idea, right? I heard it, But I think that it makes sense. What is it talking about? What else would we think, rather than the God is one? What else would it be? And the answer is, well, we already have this idea that there is actually a multiplicity of him. Right? You have, or you have it, you will have it, however you date things, you have this idea that there's this multiplicity of Yud-Kei Vav-Keis, our God, right? They're different ones in different places, right? So you're right that, and I think you're right also to correct me, because I was presenting as if it were a polemical statement, and you're right that it's not a polemical statement. It's not arguing with something actively, but I think that in order to understand the statement, what else would we think? I think that it is understandable in this context. That's what I think. Yeah.
Well, wider. I mean, did the Jew? It's an old question. Did the Jews? The ancient Hebrews, did they worship God like Yud-Hey Vav-Hey as the only God, or as one God among many? God is a jealous, like the
Okay.
they brought.
So it's pretty clear that they worshipped other gods, and they worship Baal. In fact, there's one thing that I didn't bring where it says it says Yud-Kei Vav-Kei right next to it, says where it's talking about Baal, and it's not clear, is it talking about Baal, or is it using another word for God? Because the word Baal could sometimes was used like instead of El, right? It could be used as like a general name for God. But yeah, sure, they worship idols. Yeah.
But I meant, no, I know
other gods. Yeah.
What was the ideal? I mean, like in the Torah, when it says Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, does he mean he's the only one, or he's the only one you're allowed to worship?
Oh, you are just going in like, right? Okay, so hold on. Okay, that's a whole different thing. It's a whole different topic. I'll tell you why. Obviously, I want to say that God's saying first you could say, so it does echad actually mean only and not one, is I think what you're saying, right? Is
the only one you're allowed to worship. Like, I mean, there are references to other gods. I mean,
there are references, right. There are biblical references to other gods, and this is a big question. Like, so what is the status of these other gods? I mean, it's hardest in that verse in Micha where it says every nation will go by our God, and every other nation will go by their God, and like everyone's going to be happy and peaceful, and this will be wonderful. That's probably the hardest verse that actually refers to other gods, I think, of all the verses. But yeah, there are references to other gods. I think that it does say in the continuation that you shouldn't worship other gods, right? It does say in the continuation that we're coming to a place where there are going to be people who are worshiping other gods. You're not allowed to worship them. You could say, does echad mean the only God as opposed to the one God? And that would be you could argue, right? You could argue what it's saying is he's the only God. He's our God. He's the only God. But it doesn't say he's the only God. He says he's the one. He's the one Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Yeah. Right. That's what it says. It doesn't say he's the only God. It says he's the one Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Right.
He's the only one. You're the one Yud-Hey Vav-Hey, and the only one you're allowed to. You're allowed.
That's not what it says in that verse. In that verse, and the next verse is talking about loving God. The
Yeah.
next verse is talking about loving God. So that verse does not seem to be particularly a statement against other gods, right? Obviously it is, right? Because any kind of statement of belief in the one Israelite God is a statement against other gods. And then in the continuation, it does say, we don't worship these foreign gods. But the actual statement is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei is our God. Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei is one, right? So if you can say Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei is the only, is only, right? It's a little bit, it's a kind of pushing it a little. So
if I could just interject,
yeah, sure, go ahead.
If it did mean that he is the only God and there are no other gods, then it would be the only place in the Torah that says that. It would be, and it doesn't say it anywhere else, because everywhere else all it says is don't worship other gods. It doesn't say there are no other gods.
So and at any rate, like I said, the verse itself doesn't. It's hard to push that meaning into the verse, given the way it is, because it's not saying. We translate it as the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, where we're used to saying Lord is God, but Lord is not God. Lord is His name, right? He is Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei is one. If you said Miriam is our teacher, Miriam is one, that wouldn't mean anything about other teachers, right? No, I don't have a complex at all. No, I really don't. I was just trying to think of an example. Anyway, so, and I see there's another comment here. To the God who is in Dan can be understood, this is from Danny and Libby, to the God who is in Dan can be understood as a perhaps Hebrew counterweight to the God whose temple was built around the same time in the Banyas, the God Pan, who was a portable universal God, albeit in a polytheistic context, as opposed to the local Hebrew God in Dan.
Yeah, bear in mind the Banyas is 1,500 meters away from Dan, and these temples were built around the same time.
So then you're saying they're doing it to the God who's in Dan and not Pan.
Yes.
That's what you're saying?
And the question is this being done by local Israelites, Hebrews, or is it being done by the Hellenists who say, on one hand, we're bringing the God Pan with us. On the other hand, we have to pay respect to the local God, the God who is in Dan, who is the God of the local people.
Oh, and then in the Aramaic, it's in, because then the question is, and then in the Aramaic, when he's saying he's making an oath, it just says in Dan, he's making an oath leha. And then you can say, well, maybe because he's saying Aleha in Aramaic, so you know that it's not Pan. That would be, it is an interesting idea. So I don't know. It's this is already beyond what I'm familiar with, but it's an interesting idea. So I brought these texts, and one of the things we just so I wanted to not only talk about, okay, so what would God be if not one, right? And how that kind of goes together with this idea that you have one temple. And of course, the idea that you have one temple was also not a particularly accepted idea. I'll just remind you, let me share my screen once more. This is, you can see this, of course, in the Israel Museum, not quite like this. This is the temple at Arrad. This is before it was buried. Like this is excavated, right? It was buried. It was buried probably in the time of Chizkiyahu or Yoshiyahu, probably Yoshiyahu. We know that there were two different reforms. One under Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, one under Yoshiyahu, Josiah, right? Where they shut down temples outside of Jerusalem. Now, Arad, of course, is in the south. It was a border temple. It was in the fortress. In other words, this is where the soldiers were. And you had a temple on the border, which on the one hand, first of all, it's a place where the soldiers themselves can sacrifice, but also it's a way of keeping the border safe, right? Of course, you want to have a temple at the border. It helps keep the border safe, right? So if you look at this, you see that now, of course, it's the excavations. We always have to be kind of careful with excavations. You can see how much of it was restored by the the more modern stuff. Let me actually hold on. Let me use my little spotlight. Okay, here. So if you see, can you see my spotlight? Okay, so here, so it was kind of constructed along the lines, more or less, of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, more or less, right? Where you have, this would have been the Kodesh, where you have the, this is the meat altar, right? The Mizbach Olah, right? And then you come in here, and this is what would be considered the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies, and this is what it looked like. Did it not? Oh, does it no longer? Is it no longer open? Here we are. Okay. So here you can see, now this is the initial reconstruction. I want to point a couple things out to you. So here we have 2 incense altars. All right. As I have mentioned to you before, when they found this temple, they found it with the incense altars lying on their side with the ashes still in the bowl of the incense altars. And so if you go to the Israel Museum now and you go and see the incense altars, you'll notice that there's a plastic sheet on top of them and the ashes are inside, right? They're very carefully laid on their sides and buried because you can't, because after all, it was a temple to God, right? They weren't going to smash it. Now notice also this sculpted kind of rock, which we think is a matzeva, right? Remember, it says you're not allowed to have a matzeva next to my altar, right? You're not allowed to have a matzeva next to my altar. So someone had a matzeva next to the altar, right? People like, if you say you can't do it, someone was doing it, right? So here we have a matzeva. In fact, this, they wanted to say that this is a matzeva. You can see that it's not. You can see that this, and they dropped it. For a while, what they wanted to say was this. And this is partially based on what I read to you before, to God and his Asherah. And the question is, what is his Asherah? Okay, so what's the story? The story with Asherah is like this. We have a bunch of places where we have a lot in Kuntillet Ajrud. There is at least one other place where there's a reference to Yud-Kei Vav-Kei and his Asherah, right? I think more than one other place. I have at least one of them also in the handout. So the question is, so is that what's Asherah? Now, biblically, an Asherah is something that you're not allowed to have next to an altar, essentially. And it sounds like it's either a tree or something that's wooden. You're not allowed to have it next to the altar. Okay, so the idea is somehow it's connected to the worship of God, right? And we know from Ugaritic texts that there was a goddess whose essentially her name was Asherah, right? Ashtaret, right? She had a name like Asherah. So the understanding is like this. There was a goddess like this. And then some aspect of her name became a word that was used for something more general. So there are 2 very different ways of interpreting Yud-Kei Vav-Kei and his Asherah. One of them is he had a wife. They thought he had a wife. Now that's kind of weird. First of all, if you're using her, Asherah to mean her name, there is one Ugaritic text where it uses Anat and says his Anat, right? But in general, if you're using the name of a goddess, you're not going to say his name of goddess. It's the name, him and Asherah, or him and his wife Asherah. You wouldn't say his Asherah. That would be a weird way to say it, right? That's first of all. And second of all, there's nothing to indicate this kind of plural, or there's nothing to indicate that you're talking about 2 gods, right? One of the proposals, and this is, I believe this is Achituv thinks this, is that Asherah is being used to mean his temple, right? Is that it's meant to use like his temple or the place where he is, like his location. So I'm blessing you to the God Yud-Kei Vav-Kei that is in Teman and his area. Now the problem is it's very hard to kind of get there, to get to that meaning of the word, either biblically or from the Ugaritic, right? So that's the problem with that. It's possibly it would be to the Yud-Kei Vav who was in Teman and some kind of monument, which was the Asherah, right? And to his monument, maybe. right? Now I obviously have a bias. I don't want to say it's that there was a belief in his wife, but I also think it's weird because you really don't see it. And you would expect also biblically, I would expect a use of Asherah that would relate to that meaning of Asherah if people actually thought that Asherah was God's wife, right? It wouldn't be relating to it just as this thing that you're not supposed to have next to an altar. Okay. So going back to Arrad, right? So the reason you have these two stones set up like this was they're like, oh, look, we've got two incense altars, and it's to God and his wife. And then we have two matzevot. Oh, perfect, right? The problem is that this isn't a matzeva. You can see it's not, right? You can see that it's not. This is very carefully carved in a very specific shape, and this is not. They don't push this anymore. I noticed that they stopped. They kind of dropped this stone, right? They're not into this stone anymore, right? This doesn't seem like a matzeva. The question is, what is the purpose of this thing? There's nothing carved on it. One of the possibilities is if you've ever seen, first of all, if you're familiar with like those statues of people praying, like or like of just people, and they think that they were meant to pray. Sometimes they even have some inscriptions on them that it seems like they were meant to be stand-ins for people praying or worshiping at a temple, right? Not Israelite temples in the broader area. And if you've ever seen things that look like they're shaped like this, but they have kind of hands like that. They have two hands on them, carved on them. They've had a whole bunch of them. And it looks, and that the interpretation is that these are people who are these are meant to be stand-ins for people raising their hands in prayer, raising their hands in worship, right? And this was something that you would do for worship, right? There is, you see this in the biblical description of worship all the time, that people raise their hands, right? So they raise their hands in worship, and these are meant to be stand-ins for people raising their hands in worship. So that's one of the theories of what a matzeva is, that a matzeva is kind of a stand-in for a worshiper or something of that nature. Who knows? This is set up here. We don't know where it stood. We don't know what its use was. We don't know where it stood. This is a reconstruction. All right. But the point that I'm bringing now is that this temple in Arrad, which again was built more or less on the model of the Mishkan or the Beit Mikdash, temples that we're used to. It was a functioning temple apparently, and it was shut down. So you had a time, and it was an official temple. It was an official temple of the Judean kingdom. Okay, the Judean kingdom had their soldiers in their fortress. It was a fortress of the Judean kingdom, and this was an official temple of the Judean kingdom. Okay, so and then at a certain point they're like, no, we can't do that. We've got to shut it down. Okay, and they shut it down. All right. So you have absolutely at a certain point the same way that I'm assuming the people who are blessing people to the God, to Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei and Teman and Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei and Shemron, they think they're perfectly okay. There was perfectly okay also to have temples in different places. All right. And then, and you can understand it, particularly as you're far from, you want to worship God. Why shouldn't we worship God? Why shouldn't we have a temple? And I'll remind you, of course, much later, in the Second Temple period, when the Jews of Elephantine, when their temple was burned down, they write to the Kohen Gadol, to the high priest in Jerusalem, saying, help us rebuild our temple, with no idea that this would be problematic at all. And they're very surprised not to get an answer, or they seem surprised not to get an answer. Why isn't he answering? Right? Because of course, if they're living in Elephantine, far from everything, they should have a temple. Why shouldn't they have a temple? Okay. So anyway, so that's about the temple. And also I'm talking about, again, this idea of an Asherah. So if you look at the text I brought you, okay, so there's the idea of an Asherah. Also, let me find, so I think this is from Judea. So what we're looking at before, so this is from Judea, and this is an inscription that also mentions God and his Asherah, or I should say, here. Yahu Asar Ketava, Yahu the Sar wrote it, the minister wrote it. Baruch Uriyahu Lashem Vela Asherato. Blessed is Uriyahu to Yud-Kei-Vav-Kei, to God, and to the Lord and to his Asherah. Okay. And we see, and then we say we have things missing. It says, and to his Asherah, and to his Asherah. And it seems like a formula. Blessed is such and such to God, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, and to his Asherah. Right. And that's one of the reasons to say maybe it's and this is actually, I believe it's supposed to be Phoenician, what we have here, which is Kodesh, holy, La Asherat, right? And one of the proofs that Achituv brings to say that Asherah is not a goddess is that we don't have anything in Phoenician that points to Asherah as a goddess. So like why would we? It doesn't seem likely. There's no indication of anything that Asherah is functioning as a goddess in any way. And I think this is important. Let me stop sharing. Hold on.
Miriam,
Yes.
are you saying that Asherah was not a goddess to the Canaanim and to the Phoenicians?
No. I'm saying that when we're looking at these inscriptions, at the point that we're looking at these inscriptions, remember, Ugaritic texts are much earlier.
Yeah.
Ugaritic texts are much earlier than this.
But 1200, like 13th century BC.
Yeah, it's much earlier. So the point, I think Achituv's point is, even if we go outside of Israel, right, and we're looking at and we're looking out, so we go outside of Israel in the same period, there's no reference to Asherah as a goddess. In other words, we have no actual proof that Asherah is a functioning goddess in the area at the time, right? Whereas with Ugaritic, so let me clarify what I'm saying. The idea is, and we have this a lot, that we have a word that was taken that may have been at its base from the goddess Asherah, right, or Ashtoreth or Atharet or whatever her name was, right, taken from her and applied to other things, to some kind of broader sense. So again, biblically, it sounds like it's some kind of tree or perhaps some kind of object, something that you would plant right next to it, and you're not allowed to have it next to your altar, which means this is something that was somehow being integrated into the worship of God, right? Because there's this idea that you're going to put it next to the altar, right? Now, so the question is, so what does it mean? You're blessed are you to God and to his Asherah. Now, I understand the people who want to say, oh yeah, it must be his goddess, but it's not, it's saying it's using God's name without a possessive, and it would be weird. It's weird. Now we do have the one place in Ugaritic where we have a not with a possessive, but in general, it would be weird to see the name of her name, and it's consistently used. It's always his Asherah, right? Except for that one place we have Asherat to Asherat, right? So that's because of that. I think it's specifically because of the Asherat or Ashrat or however it's pronounced. I think specifically because that makes Achituv think that it's to a temple district, because if it's dedicated to, and you write it on the jar, it would seem to be dedicated to some kind of temple or something like that. And I think that's why he wants to say that it's the temple, or let me be like the temple district or something like that. It's hard to get there from the biblical sense of Asherah. But the point is not that in Ugaritic it's not a goddess. The point is that by the time we get to these texts, it's not a goddess, right? It's lost its original meaning, right? And that's why they can use it the way they do. Now you can argue because you just have the same formula over and over, and it could mean a bunch of different things. So like it's kind of hard. Like if you can connect it to biblically, it's hard to get to like a larger area. I would think that biblically the easiest thing to do is to say that it's to God and to his monument. Particularly if it's something that you put next to an altar, right? Saying you're blessed to God and to this monument to him that we always have next, wherever God lives, But again, I know that there are a lot of people that want to say it's a hard fight to have based on what we've got. That's pretty much So yeah.
But Miriam, we have very few texts on the spirit in general. Like, we're talking about the 8th century BC or so. There's so few texts. It's hard to expect we'd find Asherah written to explain what it means.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I thought that Achituva, I mean, Achituva has the same, in a way, I think the same bias that I do. Maybe not as strong, but I think I do think that Achituva very much wants it to not be the wife of a god, right? As I do. So I think you're absolutely right. And that's why I say it's very, very hard to argue either way. I think the strongest argument is that grammatically it's a very weird way to use the name of a goddess. There's no reason to say that it means wife, right? If you say, like, why would Asherah become wife? That there's no reason for that. And there is reason to say, because the biblical use of it, that it indicates some kind of something that would be in the temple, right? Now, of course, the argument against it is, well, why would you have it in the temple, or why would you have it next to the altar? Because it's somehow meant to represent his wife, but there's no indication of something like that. And you would have an indication. I really do think you would have an indication of that if that was what was going on. You would have an indication when you have the prescription not to do it. I think it would say, God is one, God has no wife, there would be something to tell you, this is why you can't put an Asherah there. This is why it's terrible. Same way as, like, there are intimations with Molech, right? That people thought that passing their kids through the fire was somehow something that God wanted. And we know that from hints, from saying, don't put through, I'm not asking things like this. There are enough hints saying that at least that possibly people thought that when they were passing their kids through the fire, this was somehow connected to worship of God, right? And that this was a way of worshiping God somehow, right? It's also obviously reading into it a little bit. At least there's some indications of that. Whereas with the Asherah, there's zero indication biblically that anyone thought that the Asherah itself was a god. It's strictly used as an object, to refer to an object that you're not allowed to use. Okay, so I have another question from Danny and Libby. Wouldn't having only one temple have made people think God was only there and not elsewhere? If you live in Jerusalem, sure. Yeah. I think that this was the downside of having one temple in Jerusalem again. And this is something that's absolutely addressed in Tanakh, in the biblical books, particularly in Yirmiyahu, right, in Jeremiah, where you have they've gone through what should have destroyed Jerusalem, right? And I'll remind everyone, right, with the northern invasion, right, of the Assyrians. And at least, I won't even say as a kid, because as a kid I didn't even get up to that point in Jewish history, but as an 18-year-old, right, when you think of it, you say, oh, then there was a northern invasion, and well, even as a kid, you're like, okay, so there was a northern exile, and the southern kingdom was perfectly fine. The kingdom of Judea was perfectly fine. They only invaded the north and they exiled them. And the answer, of course, is no. They invaded the entire area. They conquered Lachish. They conquered, and Micha has a whole list. Like, they conquered the entire countryside. Yeshayahu talks about Yerushalayim, right, being left like a hut, right, in the middle of the fields, because only Jerusalem was left. That was the feeling. Everything had been invaded. Everything had been destroyed. And only Jerusalem survived. So people in Jerusalem are like, hey, we survived because the temple's here. God lives here. We can't be destroyed ever. Everyone else, well, that's too bad. You can move here, but we are safe because God lives here, right? And the idea was that everyone was supposed to come to Jerusalem and worship God in Jerusalem and say he's a God that belongs to the entire nation, right? But yeah, there was this idea that God lives in Jerusalem again and again. That's why it can't be destroyed. Right? And then you have these two different ways of interpreting the destruction, one that God left and the other that God destroyed his own house, right? I think the idea that God destroyed his own house is kind of later. But in terms of, like, if you read Eicha, you do have that idea that God himself took part in destroying his own house. And that's how you deal with it. Or you could take or you have like Yechezkel, where God left. God left. There was no point. And in Yirmiyahu, what is the point? Why is Jerusalem not safe? Not because God hasn't lived there, by the way. What's the symbolic act that Yirmiyahu does so that he can understand God's point of view of the whole thing? He has this loincloth. Remember, he's got the loincloth, and God's like, take the loincloth and put it in this crack, like by the sea, and it gets all moldy and gross. And he comes, he takes it, and God's like, okay, now you can wear it. And he's like, no, I can't wear it. It's all holy and gross and disgusting. I can't wear this. And God's like, yeah, look at Jerusalem. It's all holy and disgusting and gross. I can't, they're no use to me. Right? The idea isn't that God didn't live in Jerusalem. The point is, it doesn't help. You aren't safe if you're crappy. If you're a crappy loincloth, then I have no use for you. Right? Right? So like, if you were good, then sure, I dwell here and you'd be great, but you're not. And so nothing's saving you now. Right? So this is there isn't a lot. You do have in like a Shlomo speech, how can this house contain me, right? So you have biblical things. Usually they date those pieces later, right? That these ideas that God doesn't just dwell in this house, but there's many more references to God dwelling in Jerusalem, right? Specifically in Jerusalem, right? As Moshe Matzitia pointed out just now. There are many references to God living in Jerusalem, and that has its own issues, specifically for the people in Jerusalem, right? For the people outside of Jerusalem, it doesn't seem to be that big an issue, except that they want to worship where they are, which is why the temples are pretty widespread, right? And that's what, and then there's the question of, in the Second Temple period, what kind of, you have prayer, you have people who are apparently saying prayers outside of the temple, even if they're not saying it in an organized way, the way they're doing it outside of Israel, perhaps, right? In the Second Temple period, have the places in Israel are called synagogue, which means literally batei knesset, right? Places where people gather. Where outside of Israel, they seem to be called proseochai, which are places where people pray. So it's actually interesting that outside of Israel, is where you actually have this kind of development, because they really are so far from the temple, apparently. They're so far from the temple, and people want to worship, right? So it has its own issues, but I think that looking back and seeing these inscriptions, we kind of understand what it meant and why it was important. I have to say that I personally always wondered, I'm like, that it's not fair. How is that fair? If you live in the Golan, why should you not be able to go and worship God the only way you can worship God, which is to go to the temple, right? Now we're so used to this whole thing. We have a million ways to worship God without going to the temple, right? Because there's no temple. But even if there were a temple at this point, we have all these different ways of worshiping God. But in those days, what did you do? You went to the temple. So of course they're going to have temples all over the place. Why is it so surprising they had bamot? They had bamot all over Judea. They had bamot all over Israel. It was like, that was the classic thing. Whenever you read about a king who isn't Chizkiyahu or Yoshiyahu, every king in Judea, he's like, he was a good king, except that there were bamot. There were different places they worshipped all over there. Of course there were. But what's the problem? What was the problem that went along with it? The problem that went along with it was that there was this very, very, for the time, a very natural belief that if I'm worshiping here, if there's a temple here to Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, there's a Yud-Kei Vav-Kei who lives here. And then there's a different Yud-Kei Vav-Kei in some way that lives in Jerusalem, and it lives in Shomron, it lives everywhere there's a temple, right? As opposed to the idea that this is just a place where we're worshiping the same God.
When does it happen?
Yes.
When does it happen that we get the sense that God is not associated just with Jerusalem? Is that with the exile to Babylonia, or when?
Lo, I do think that there absolutely is absolutely a statement that God made heaven and earth, God has control over everything, right? But the idea of what is a temple, right? What does temple mean? And again, you do have, so it also depends a lot on when you date Shlomo's speech. Shlomo's speech in Melachim and Kings, where he says, can a house contain me? Da, 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 right? That God says, like, right? And that whole thing. So the question, when do you date it, right? When is it from? Like, if you say, well, it's correct if it's dated according to its context, and that's pretty early. But actually, not so much, because Melachim is the whole thing is compiled relatively late, right? Because it's compiled in the exile, essentially, if you're talking about the Book of Kings. Has to be, right? Because it goes up to then. But there is absolutely a sense that God has control over everything, all areas, right? And that's a basic idea of the biblical books, right? You have a basic idea, like you have the idea in northern Israel when Amos and Hosea are talking to the Israelites, the Israelites, the northern kingdom of northern Israel, there's a very clear understanding that God will punish them. God is there, right? They also, by the way, don't battle the idea that there's a temple there. That's not their thing, right? Hosea and Amos, their problem is not that there's a temple in Shomron. Their problem is that everyone sucks. Hosea's problem is that they're worshiping Baal. That's Hosea's big problem, right? He has other problems too, but Hosea's big problem is their relationship with God that has broken down completely, and that they worship Baal. Okay. Amos's problem is the tremendous amount of immorality and the fact that they think everything's great and everything's going their way, and so they can pretty much do whatever they want. Their problem is not that there's a house of worship to God in the area, right? However, there is there is kind of a, like, so, and Amos himself seems to be a Judean, so that's also kind of colors some of the things that's going on there. But the basic idea of a lot of Tanakh is that everyone has the same God, and everyone should have the same God, and that God is everywhere. Maybe not in the sense that, like, we as kids used to sing without even thinking of, oh, God lives in the temple, because there is no temple, right? Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. Like, that idea, but that idea is really is kind of basic in a lot of biblical thought, and he also lives in the temple. Do you know what I mean? Like, he's everywhere, because he knows about everything. He knows about, there's a whole question how omniscient is God, right? But he knows everything that's going on, right? And he has control over everything, and he does interfere in everything everywhere, right? But he happens. But where do you go to worship him, right? You worship him where he is, quote unquote. And again, it's hard to kind of go back and parse exactly how people interpreted this. Like, how did people really think about it, without kind of taking our thought and placing it on them. But I do think throughout there absolutely is this idea that God is with the people of Israel, right? And not just, if he's in Jerusalem, that doesn't mean he's not anywhere else, right? And I do also think this is part of the idea of the unity of God, right? That God, it is the same God. I think that if there were, and I think that the tendency to not think in terms of the unity of God, and because that was a tendency throughout the area, right? Again, other gods also, and Greek gods also. Again, it was a classic way of thinking of gods in the polytheistic system, and it doesn't, and so it was a natural thing for them to say, oh, okay, temples mean he's in different versions or different somethings, right? Yes.
The personal prayers that we learned before, that we talked about before, where is that going on? Is that just out in the open? Where are people giving their prayer?
So I think, it's interesting, because if we're talking about, for example, and Moshe Greenberg said this when he looked at biblical prayer, okay?
Mm-hmm.
He said, the way you see biblical prayer is, the idea is that anyone can just kind of look up and quote, kind of like, and pray to God in their own words. The idea is, right, that Shimshon, in the middle of the Philistines who are making fun of him and having some kind of party, he can turn to God and say, help me out, right? You don't have to be in a particular place in order to pray. Now, you also have the story of Hannah, who was actually at the temple praying, right? She prays at the temple, right? So it's not that no one prays at the temple, but the idea is that you can, particularly as you have a kind of line to God. You can pray to God, right? And that you can always turn to God in prayer. If we talk about and that continues. So for example, if we talk the way people interpret there's the Psalm, the Mizmor that's in the middle of, it's in the middle of Yonah, right? Where he's in the belly of the fish and right. And it's, and then, seaweeds around my neck and and there's a theory that actually was something that sailors would say. Sailors in times of trouble, or sailors would just say it because they wanted to come back. And it's like, let me return and pay my oath to God. In other words, let me pay the sacrifices I promised. Let me return safe, right? And the idea is, so when are they saying this prayer? They're not saying it at the temple. They're saying it when it assumes on the boat, right? They're saying it on the ship. Okay, now again, when do you date that? That's something else. But the idea is in the context of Yonah, right? It's a good thing that all the non-Jews are turning to their gods to pray, and they're like, Yonah, hey, what are you doing? He goes to sleep because he's cut himself off from God, right? But what he should be doing is praying to God. He's on the boat. It's going to go down. He should be praying to God, right? And so the idea is that you can pray to God wherever. You don't have to be in the temple to pray to God, and you don't have to be in the temple to be listened to. There at the same time, what we saw in the inscriptions was that there's this kind of thing like where it seems to indicate, first of all, it does seem to indicate when you saw the picture of those two guys and it says you'll pray to God and he'll respond to you. So one wonders if the fact that they're saying you're blessed to the God who is in this place is kind of in place of being at the temple. In other words, you're directing your prayers to that particular, God who's there, right? And that's kind of in place of like being there, right? But this is all conjecture, right? But I do think that, again, this idea that we see this idea throughout biblical texts that you can pray to God anywhere, really, and perhaps be answered, and that kind of connects to the idea that God is watching everything, right? And he's interfering everywhere, right? And like if you read Yechezkel, he makes statements about the way God treats the world everywhere outside of Israel, right? So there's this idea not just to interfere on behalf of Israelites or Judeans, but just in general. So that's certainly, but I think that's throughout. So yes.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that we often make this mistake of thinking of monotheism as a steady progression from polytheism to monotheism, where the historical and archaeological record seem to suggest that you have roughly a 1,000-year period of constant back and forth and back and forth. I mean, the story of Hanukkah, which is already towards the end of the Second Temple period, can be viewed as, at least some of the forms of Hellenization, as backsliding towards towards polytheism.
Well, it's interesting that I actually wouldn't have pointed to Hanukkah, because with Hanukkah, there was a lot of this thing where we want to be a Hellenistic city, and certain things come along with being a Hellenistic city, whether or not we believe it, or whether or not we, this is just what you do. So it was, I feel like that was less of a and it wasn't particularly popular. It was something that people were kind of coming in from above and saying, this is what we're going to do. So it seems less of a populist sliding towards polytheism. But if you would say, like, for example, the later belief in demonic forces, right? Which is much later, which is like then you're talking Second Temple period, and then you could say, well, that also feels a little bit, now at that point already, they're thinking in terms that we could already think of as being theological almost. almost. In other words, they're already thinking in terms of weight, but God controls everything. So how can we use this demon to explain evil? They're not thinking exactly like that, but you can see that they're not allowing the demon this broad range that would make you question whether God's controlling everything. Like they have an answer for how can you have this demon if God is controlling everything. They have answers for it, right? But you do see that there are very powerful reasons to want polytheism, right? There's there's just what people believe in the area, which, you know, whatever people are believing, that's kind of what you might want to believe. If you remember, it's like it reminds me a little bit of, if you ever read Terry Pratchett, Small Gods, where there's this where they reverse it, where actually, you know, it's the disc world. The disc world is the world is actually a disc that's on the back of four elephants who stand on the back of the great Atwin, which is this giant turtle that kind of swims through space, right? So there are these two cultures, one that believes in the great god Om, I think it is, and then this other culture, which is like supposed to be the Greek Western culture, that they kind of discover that it's a disc on the back, and the great god, which is like this monotheistic thing. It's kind of like, you know, and we circle the sun, we go around the sun, which is like the great god Om, and and we're around Earth that circles the sun, right? And then this Greek culture that discovers that, like, no, we're actually a disc on elephants that are on a turtle, right? And in the person of an Om, he's like, it just sounds right. It just sounds right that, you know, we're on elephants on a turtle. So if you're one of like the Judeans, the Israelites, and you're in this neighborhood of nations that all believe in kind of polytheistic things, and when something bad happens, it's very easy to blame one of the bad gods, or some squabbling between gods, or they have all sorts of other things. There are these chaotic forces that the gods don't really control, and they have these, you know, and it works kind of, right? Or they need rains, they worship the rain god, because why not, right? So there's certain things, there's a certain way of thinking that also is going to affect Israelites and Judeans at different points. And then you'll have that back and forth. Once you get to Yirmiyahu, at the very least, they're not believing much in idols. Like actual idols are universally kind of seen as ridiculous. Like these are clearly very stupid, right? And they're also not, so there are certain things that become much clearer, you could say at that point, like theologically, once you get to the end of the First Temple period. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons that they would like want to. There are reasons that polytheism was appealing. If you think, even also in terms of, if you think the way the Romans did polytheism, right? The Romans are like, why tell these myths? The myths are stupid. The important thing, the Romans said, is to bring the right sacrifices to the right God at the right time. And they're like, we have it down to a science. We know exactly what to bring. Why tell a story? We don't need stories. Those are dumb, right? So if you have this idea that I can do this thing and then the God will give me rain, that's a very appealing way of looking at things. I mean, that's why you have all these prophets, and we have the prophetic books, right? All these prophets say, stop it, stop it, stop it. Right? So yeah, there's a real back and forth, but we see points where you can kind of point to things and say, okay, polytheism is not really a threat at this point in terms of belief, right? So like the end of the First Temple period, right? It's more of a struggle to understand, how did our God lose, right? Than to say we're wrong for believing in our God and only our God, right? How could this, you have to explain, how can this happen? But it's less, it's not, the polytheism isn't quite the same thread of belief. And again, with Hanukkah, I think it's a very practical thing. It's a very practical thing. It's like, we want to be a Hellenistic city. This is what we need to do to be a Hellenistic city. And we don't want to be punished for not having X statue or whatever. And a lot of it was top down, which is why you had a rebellion. you had a rebellion because a lot of that was top down, and the people in general were not for that sort of thing, right?
Mm.
And Jews tended to rebel. Jews, when you put idols in their temples, they tended to rebel. Um, so that was like a thing. Yeah.
Mary, you go back to this
Yes.
idea. You're saying that by the end of the first temple, they're not backsliding to polytheism. What are they doing though? I'm trying to think of the mindset of the people when the temple's destroyed. Like where do you, if you still want to have faith, what are you doing with yourself?
Well, you can read. I mean, if you want, I gave a class on Yechezkel. I taught Yechezkel for a year, but you can kind of look at Yechezkel and you can kind of see part of what at least Yechezkel is trying to do for the people who are exiled, because those exiled people have a particular problem because they're still Jews in Jerusalem and only they were exiled, and they have to deal with that, which is very, very problematic. They're like, maybe we're the ones who are lost. And then the question is, how do you even stay a Jew outside of the land of Israel with no temple, right? That they're the first ones who have to deal with this. They're not the first ones, because the Israelite kingdom supposedly had to deal with it, but they were gone. They disappeared, right? Except for the ones who managed to escape to Judea. These guys they're the first ones who have to say, now what? Now what? And there's a reason that we have the dry bones. We did this last week. We did the dry bones thing last week, but there's a reason that you need that vision and that thing, that you feel like you're lifeless. You feel like you're just a bunch of bones. You're ready to be buried. And I'm telling you, you're going to come back. I'm telling you, you're going to come back. And that becomes a big, and the fact is and I think part of what helped was that honestly, the first exile was not that long. It just wasn't that long. It just didn't take that long for them to be able to come back. And I think that helped a lot. I think that helped a lot. And then once they do come back, there is that knowledge of what it means to be in exile. And at the same time, a tremendous, you could say, belief almost in Jerusalem and the importance of Jerusalem, which is very interesting. And that's what I did when I taught Ezra and Nehemiah last year. Yeah. So it's it's fun. It's great. It's all there. You can just look at the book and see how they tried to have at least one piece of how they tried to deal with it. And other things we just don't know. We have to guess. We have to wonder. If we look again at the Babylonian, what is it, Ajrud in Babylonia, and we have this town of Jews. They kept their names. We don't really know much else about what they did, but they kept using theophoric names with Yud Hey Vav, so that you knew that they were Jewish and you knew which God they believed in, right? So I think that's a good note to end on. So in this class, we looked at a possible explanation of how people of the time understood the issue of God being one, and how that connected to the having one place of worship, how easy it was to kind of lose that concept once you had multiple places of worship, particularly early on. And the problematic nature of what is an Asherah. We also looked at that. And how differences in how Israelites, Judeans, Jews saw monotheism, right? And as we went through our history. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And have a good night.